I want to first apologise if I come across quite nervous. I've done 2 webinars, but I think it's less daunting like when you're behind the screen. So please bear with me. So a bit about me. I'm a BPS Chartered Sport and Exercise Psychologist in training. I'm an Assistant Academy Sports Psychologist at Leicester City Football Club. I've done research in disordered eating in sport, so I'll tell you a bit about that today. I'm an ex-international level powerlifter, so I competed for Team GB, won gold in the squat at the European Championships in 2015. I'm a female coaching network academy coach, England athletics coach, mainly involved with throwing events, British weightlifting level 1 coach, and an ambassador for the eating disorder charity Beat. And I think you've got some of the information in your packs today. So the aims of my presentation will be to share a bit about my own experience and to clarify the differences between disordered eating and eating disorders. I think the terms are often used interchangeably, but I think there's important to recognise the difference between these two. Help you identify some of the symptoms and the effects on sports performance and what you can do as coaches and parents. Give you some idea about the risk factors and how we can alleviate some of these, and more specifically to athletes, so any pressures in sport that we can help with. Treatment challenges, what coaching parents can do, and some takeaway messages. Okay, so this is my own experience. Quite a lot of numbers on here. So sport was always a safe haven for me from a young age. I'd go to school early, come home late, found it really, really enjoyable. But at the age of 15, I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. I was a javelin thrower at the beginning, and I didn't know what anorexia was. I got down to an extremely low weight. My BMI was 11.8, so when it goes below 12, that's where organ failure starts to occur. Osteopenia, was the thinning of the bones. Luckily now, they're a lot better now, so they're a lot stronger from the weightlifting, which is good. However, I think a good statistic to get out there is that 50% of people that have anorexia go on to develop bulimia. I think it's about 20% that go the other way, from bulimia to anorexia. I think it just shows that they lie along a continuum. And you can interchangeably go between them. Also with depression as well. So I didn't have depression before my eating disorder. It was from the actual effects of the bulimia that it had on me. That led to me taking 5 years out of university and 2 long-term inpatient stays in Cambridge, Adam Brooks Hospital in Cambridge, yeah. I returned to powerlifting. I'll go through later on how I got back into it. But unfortunately, it was only 6 months after I got discharged that it was the consequences of bulimia with very extremely low potassium that I had a cardiac arrest. But luckily, that was in a doctor's office, so that was lucky. So it took 10 years to find out the true reason behind the eating disorder. Some of you might not know this is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is developmental trauma. And I still experience the long-term physical and psychological consequences of those experiences. And I want to get across how it still affects my ability to train today. However, I think it's important to say that athletes with eating disorders can overcome and manage the issues with appropriate support. So athletes are often viewed as healthy. However, the eating behaviours of some athletes may be associated with disordered eating or even an eating disorder. They're mental illnesses. They aren't a fad diet or something that you just want to try out. They can take over someone's life and the lives of those around them. But I think coaches and support staff are in a great position to help identify these illnesses at an early stage before they become a clinical issue. So I think there's a need for sport-specific support and treatment especially regarding exercise as well. So on here, this is the continuum I was talking about. On the left will be the ideal. It would be the healthy attitudes to exercise and food. However, on the other side, the clinical issues, but it's the important bit in the middle, which is the disordered eating, where I think that coaches and everyone working within sport can have a massive impact. I think it can be normal for athletes to slide along this scale here, but not all the way along, because either they don't have all the risk factors to make it a clinical issue, or they've managed to receive help early. And I think that's shown in the research where early intervention is key. The main difference between clinical and the subclinical would be the intensity of the symptoms and the frequency of the behaviours as well. So I'll go into more detail in the next few slides. So I'll give you a bit of background behind the clinical eating disorders. So there's anorexia nervosa. This is probably one of the most common ones that you'd be aware of. It's the one that's mostly in the media. It's where you fail to maintain 85% of your expected weight, not seeing their body the way others do. I think that's down to malnutrition and change in the brain activity, that you cannot see yourself as others see you. Being secretive about their eating, doing lots of extra exercise, feeling dizzy or faint, wearing baggy clothes to hide their body shape and to hide the weight loss, feeling cold all the time because you don't have a high body fat percentage, and especially isolating themselves from others. So although these are the signs in the general population, they're still applicable to athletes in sport. So, bulimia nervosa is where you binge on large amounts of food in one go and then either purge by over-exercising or making yourself sick. So some of the signs would be yo-yo weight changes. So I think one point when I had anorexia, I was 29 kilos, and I went up to 60 kilos and then back down to 40. I didn't know where my natural body weight was, and I think that was quite hard for my coach to help me with, but the nutritionist wasn't very supportive either, so especially because I was an athlete as well, so the muscle mass wasn't taken into account into the body mass index. It was just height and weight, whereas muscle weighs twice as much as fat. Going to the toilet after meals, isolating themselves from others, poor skin, scars on the back of your knuckles, and feeling bad about body image. So binge eating disorder. I think on Twitter I saw this thing about a few months ago. Joey Julius is a good example of this. I think he told a great story. He's an ex-Penn State American footballer. How weight in football had always been an advantage to him because he had more weight behind the tackles. However, he felt extremely low about himself, and no one else in his team knew, so they didn't help him. Spending lots of money on food. I think I saw a statistic that an average family spends about £30,000 on a child that has an eating disorder. I don't think that's even realised. So, self-conscious about eating in front of others, loss of confidence and low self-esteem, and also isolating themselves from others. So disordered eating. So like I said before on the continuum, that before it becomes a clinical issue, there are signs that athletes will display. However, they are difficult because they can help with performance. So engaging in exercise beyond the training program that the coach gives them, inability to take rest days without feeling guilty, unhealthy attitudes, beliefs in food, frequent injuries. But the problem we have here is that in some sports, like anti-gravity sports, so ski jumping, high jump, it's where a lower body weight can actually help with performance. So there was a study that I did last year. I interviewed 10 applied sports psychologists, and they noticed these symptoms and they tried to bring them up with the coach, but the coach would say, no, the athlete doesn't have an issue, they're performing fine, let them continue. And I thought this was a real problem. So I think the idea that I'm trying to do more research in the area to see what sports psychologists are competent to do and what we're not allowed to do legally. But at the moment it's not really being supported. I mean, Scottish Athletics has been great for letting me speak here, but a lot of the other researchers don't see it as our issue. increased fatigue, dizziness, fainting, dehydration, impaired sleep. So these were all early symptoms of clinical eating disorders, which I think that are a red flag. And I think the more of these that you see in an athlete, then definitely I think you can intervene before. So these are some of the risk factors that I think that put athletes specific at risk to developing eating disorders. There's a genetic vulnerability. So I think there's some evidence that suggests eating disorders can have a genetic basis. However, the biological causes of eating disorders are still not fully understood. I'm not sure if you're aware of, I think they were the Frost twins from the Isle of Wight. They were involved in sport, I think steeplechase maybe, I could be wrong. So they both had an eating disorder and they both left sport, but it also happened at the time that they both went to study at Loughborough University. Now that could be a number of things. You never know whether it's nature versus nurture debate. Was it because of their genes, or was it because of the environment they were growing up with, alongside a massive transition of going to university? So I think there's more research that's needed in this area. Now the psychological factors, behaviours and personality characteristics, low self-esteem, perfectionism in particularly, obsessive-compulsive traits, trauma, and excessive worrying or fear. I'll go through these in more detail with the next few slides, because I think the psychological factors that we try and promote in athletes can actually easily slide along to a disordered side that can promote unhealthy eating patterns. So it's when to be aware of when these traits are good and when they're unhealthy. So thirdly, socio-cultural influences. So anything in the external environment, societal pressure to achieve and succeed, troubled family or personal relationships, peer pressure, and high pressure environment. So sport is just one of these. I often wonder, if I didn't do sport, would I have got an eating disorder? And I think my answer would still be yes. I was under a lot of pressure in school as well. And I think sport is just another high pressure environment. So if there was something else that happened in my life, so a bereavement, I think I would have still gone on to develop an eating disorder. So I think the more factors that an athlete has of these, I think it increases their risk to developing disordered eating. So I think just getting to know your athletes, really, getting to know their background, that's one of the first things we do as a sports psychologist. Try and find out why they do sport, what they get from it, whether they enjoy it, do they feel pressure at home, how are they getting on at school, that sort of stuff. So have a closer coach-athlete relationship, I think, is a good point there. So the identification issues. So the same competitive personality traits and perfectionistic tendencies that make athletes successful are also factors that contribute to the development of eating disorders. So like I said previously, if you look on the left, these are all ideal traits that we would like to see in a top-level athlete. But on the right is where it can be pushed too far. So if you're an over-controlling coach, then that more likely to push them down this way. So I think it's just trying to intervene as soon as we can, and yeah. Okay, so the sport-specific pressures. So I think this is where coaches can have a massive, massive impact, because when an athlete is identified as having an eating issue, they get referred to see a clinical psychologist, which is absolutely the right thing that you should do, refer them to a clinical psychologist. However, only a few would have experience working in sport and would even listen to your experience, because I don't want to sound like I'm keep slagging off the NHS, but yeah, they don't look at the athlete, the athletic identity. They don't take that into account at all. So I think a multidisciplinary approach is the key to this, where a sports psychologist, a physiologist, S&C coach, GP, everyone, I think the more people involved, and if there's good communication, then I think that's the most important thing. So I think the more factors that an athlete has of these, I think it increases their risk to developing disordered eating. So Okay, so high prevalence in weight-based and athletic sports, but this doesn't mean that athletes in other sports do not develop eating issues. So I was a javelin thrower. Not, it's not dependent on really your weight or So there's been people that get it in weightlifting, powerlifting. So it's not just not just athletic sports. Teammates have been shown to be a source of weight pressure for athletes. I don't know how many of you saw Bobby Clay's interview. Something that I picked up, especially from that one, was that she didn't get her period, but it was normal in the training group. I think there's more research needed in this area as well, especially the influence of teammates, comments from teammates, expectations, the constant comparisons between you and another athlete in the group. So I think the coach can play a role here, is where they can try and communicate a healthy message among the athletes so they understand what to expect when they're growing up, the transitions that they'll be going through, the fact that they're all individuals, that they're not just a ranking. I think that's quite important. A poor coach-athlete relationship. So if you have a poor relationship with your coach, you're less likely to ask for help. An unhealthy, ego-oriented training environment. So if it's always focused on performance, that can increase your chances of developing disordered eating. There's a study by De Bruin in 2008. I haven't put that on there, but that's a good research paper to look up. They found that they interviewed 94 gymnasts and dancers, and there was a very, very strong correlation between ego-oriented training environment and disordered eating. And they found the opposite with mastery-oriented training environment and disordered eating. It was much lower. So I'm quite surprised that there's not more research in that area, because that's quite an important finding for me as a sports psychologist, because that's something, the training environment is something that I can control. And the fact that it was related to lower levels of disordered eating, that makes me think that, okay, one of the implications of that study was to try and promote a mastery training environment. So I would work alongside the coaches to try and encourage them they're getting the right message across. They're not always focused on performance. So it's something I do with the throwing events back home in Watford, is there's lower need to measure every throw or every 5 throws in the training session. It's more about the process, more about technique. We throw, even in the summer, we go inside and throw into a net because it takes the outcome away. They can't see how far the discus or the javelin's going, so they're focused on performance. And I think that's less likely for comparisons as well. Another pressure would be following an onset of an injury. So if an athlete is injured, their sporting identity is questioned, because if when sport's taken away from them, what can they do? And if they don't have healthy coping mechanisms, this may be one that they would turn to. They may not want to eat. So if you do have an injured athlete, then be aware. Maybe refer them to see a sports psychologist, their GP, just to see that they are doing okay. Transitions, uncertainty as well. So if they're going off to uni, that'll be another one. If they're moving away from home, changing coach. So why do athletes need treatment? So this relates back to the study that I did last year, how the coach would only really intervene if there was an issue with performance. But as you can see, when the athlete deteriorates without intervention, performance will eventually suffer. So even if athletes do lose weight initially, and it does help with their performance, they do jump further, higher, run faster, it won't last very long, and research has shown this. So maybe educating the athletes around this to say, yes, you might be having a good run at the moment, but trying to educate that what they're doing is not normal, and maybe give them examples of what is normal, give them an idea. I think at the moment I still don't know what normal eating is, so I think that would have helped me as an athlete, I think. The poor performance increases the pressure on the athlete, and that in turn becomes a way that the athlete copes with this pressure. As symptoms worsen, athlete isolates themselves from others even more. So then it becomes a vicious cycle, so it seems impossible to break. So the message here would be important to intervene before the performance suffers. So I think there is a tendency to always look at the short-term performance, but I like to try and measure them up. Even if they are performing well, what is the consequence for their long-term health and their long-term mental well-being? So I always try to relate back to the athlete's performance as a way that gets them to buy in to what you're trying to educate them about. So that the body is tremendously resilient, so athletes can sometimes perform well despite having a serious eating disorder, but eventually the athlete begins to suffer both physically and psychologically. So these are just some, again, if you do a lot of testing, a lot of measures with your athletes, then these are some that you could actually maybe test for. So the VO2 max, running speed, if you see that they are struggling with the sessions and they're never used to, then that could be a sign. If they're turning up to training feeling really tired, and I put that one on there, if they're feeling isolated as well. So I use this. If there is an athlete that I think is suffering, I try to relate it back to performance and how healthy eating more, fueling themselves before training will help reduce these effects. So at the bottom there's relative energy deficiency syndrome, which is where you have lower calorie intake than what is needed for your body to function healthily. I think it was termed the female athlete triad, but now this term is used more to take into account that males also suffer. Because in the female athlete triad there was osteoporosis, disordered eating, but now so just males felt that they weren't taken into account. So I think it's not just a female issue. In the general population, and it's the same as for athletes, 90% are females, but 10% are males. So when I was an inpatient, the first time there was just one male, the second time there was 4 males. So whether that's increasing or maybe because the awareness is getting better, I don't know. Treatment challenges for the athletes in the UK, I think I mentioned this a little bit. So Caroline Plateau has done some research that explored the experiences of female athletes with eating disorders during treatment, and this was in England only. And with the interviews, they found that the athletes felt out of place, and they struggled with coping with exercise transitions. So feeling out of place, it was ignoring the athletic side of them. So whenever I would bring up my own sport, they would say that I would only want to do sport so I could burn calories, but that really wasn't the case for me. I loved sports since I was a young age, and I felt incredibly frustrated that I felt different. Like my experience of anorexia was very, very different to the other people who were receiving treatment, but I wasn't listened to. So I think that my coach helped me a lot actually with this. He reminded me that just go through it, just keep pushing through it. I'm probably there's very few that may have inpatient treatment as an athlete. I just kept pushing. Coping with exercise transitions. So exercise is not in the NICE guidelines for treatment for eating disorders. So I managed to push when I was on the ward the second time for just some education and one-to-one sessions about how I can incorporate exercise back into my life when I leave the ward. For for the first few weeks I was there, I wasn't allowed off the ward. It was a lot of sitting down. If I went from powerlifting to sitting down for many hours a day, it was incredibly painful on my body, just getting cramps and back pain. So I found that talking about exercise was incredibly helpful before I left the ward, because I was ready to go back into sport. I suffered with excessive exercise, so I would go to the gym about 8 hours a day when I was ages 18 to 20, because at that time I wasn't in university, so it became one of my main coping mechanisms, just something for me to do. So I found that helpful, just knowing what was normal, what my thoughts were around exercise, and realising that they weren't healthy and that I was mainly just exercising to burn calories. So maybe that can be a conversation you can have with your athletes. If you see them training a lot, ask them what they're doing. If they say that maybe, I need to lose a bit of fat, then that might be something to worry about. It's the reason why they're training. If they have a session, if it's part of your session, then that's fine. But and also if they're injured or if they're ill, they need to learn that it's important to rest as well. And I still have very bad trouble with that. Just learning to listen to my body. So that's something you can do with all athletes, not just athletes that have eating disorders. So just building greater awareness. There's few clinical eating disorder specialists in the UK with experience treating athletes. However, I put Dr. John R. Kellis there. He's based in Leicestershire. He's definitely one to get in contact with if you are an athlete or you know an athlete that is having issues, because he helped me tremendously. He helped me get inpatient treatment, where usually it's outpatient treatment that's always wanted for you, which is in the community. But if it's not working, it's not working. You need something more intensive. So additional support for athletes is needed, I think, around exercise especially. So I've put here just the different people that you can get involved. I've probably missed a few off. Sorry if I have. But, so in the USA, I really like this. They view it as an injury. So I think that if they view it as an injury, then athletes are more likely to come forward and say they have an issue, because if you recognise it as an injury, you're allowing them to have time off to focus on themselves, to recover, knowing that they will eventually return to the sport. I think it's the unknown that really causes some distress to athletes, because they don't know whether they're going to be allowed to return back to the sport, whether they're going to be completely dropped. So I know in Leicester City, with the academy, we have contracts with every player. And it says that if they notice these symptoms, especially around mental health, they will be, there is support available for them. This is the route that they would go down, the type of treatment that they would get. So they're all very educated in advance. And we have mental health workshops. I've even done a talk on disordered eating as well. So you'd think it might not happen in football, but surprisingly it does. This is significantly encouraged help-seeking behaviours from athletes. So athletes with eating disorders experience similar difficulties to athletes with any injury. So they'll be mourning the temporary or permanent loss of sport. And it's what they do with that time when they're away from sport, which is really important. So there's this exercise that I do that I ask how much of the pie does sport occupy. So draw a circle and then divide the pie into the different areas of your life that you do. So for me at the time, probably 90% sport, 10% would be school. So when sport was taken away, I had 90% left of me that I didn't know what to do with. And it was easy just to get stuck in the eating disorder because I had nothing else really to fall back on. And I think that's the same with any athlete that's injured. it's important for them to be a well-rounded person and not just an athlete. And I think that's something we try to push a lot in Leicester City Academy. They get education, they try and not specialise in football, they try and do other sports, just to build up for when they do eventually maybe get dropped. Limited interaction with the training group. Something that helped me, my coach encouraged me to come along to training sessions even when I was unwell, and that was actually how I got into coaching. So in the beginning, I would just sit there and watch really, just to learn more about the sport. And it really helped me fill my time because I still felt I was at training, even though I wasn't participating in it. Uncertainty about regaining prior level of performance, I think that will always be there with any injury. Patience and time are needed. So this is just an example. I think you've got this in your booklet. So a return to play protocol. So just some of the things that the athlete would be aware of, and for the coaches really, for when they do return. So something I use is the RPE, which is the rate of perceived exertion. So I think it's important here that when athletes return to sport, like for me, I literally doubled my body weight, so I had a completely different body. My biomechanics changed, the way I walked changed. Now I'm a bit lopsided. That's the way that I regained the muscle. So I wish I had more support from an S&C coach, especially. And just learning, I think the RPE is great because it builds your own awareness of how your body reacts, how much you can handle, and it measures the progression as well. So from week to week, if you can push it a little bit higher, then it's a sense of achievement for you. So I think that's good. So there's use of exercise in recovery. So research focusing specifically on eating disorders in athletes suggests a return to sport can increase motivation for recovery. So this was really important for me as an athlete because I knew that, or even still now, if I keep myself well, I'm going to be able to continue in sport. So I think this can be quite hard for athletes if they do need inpatient treatment and intensive treatment. Hopefully they don't get to that point, but they need to always understand that they can get better, they can return to sport, but their expectations of what they may achieve in sport when they return may have to change. I realised that I couldn't really go back to javelin. It was a lot of strain on my body, but I went into powerlifting, so that's a bit weird one. But I enjoyed that more. Although last year I decided that I couldn't really continue at that high level. I think my powerlifting at international level was only 2 years, so it was very, very short. However, I managed to get to a quite high level, which I was pretty happy with. But I forgot where I was going with this. How well felt unhealthy attitudes to exercise must be addressed via a specialist concurrently. Oh, yeah, that was it. So last year I decided to leave powerlifting because I needed at least 3 rest days in a week. Sometimes I would have to take a week off at a time. There's still days now where I can't get out of bed. That's just the after effects of what I've put my body through. I would love to still compete in sport, but I have to be realistic at the end of the day. There are psychological benefits of exercise. So yoga can help with your breathing mechanics, your posture. Resistance training helped me a lot, increased my bone density. Group sessions as well. So source of social support, and I think that's quite important for an athlete that has an eating disorder because they tend to isolate themselves a lot because the illnesses are incredibly shameful. There's a lot of stigma around them. So I think the more people around them, the better. So the potential long-term complications. So this is one of the key messages really that I want to get across from today. Do or will these still impact the health and future sports performance of the athlete? So I'm not aware of any research for focusing on the return of athletes to sport that have had eating disorders. So there's a lot of research out there of preventing it and supporting athletes during it, but not really after. And in my opinion, the recovered endpoint is it's a grey area. There's no clear cut-off point. I think there is in terms of the medical model where you don't classify as having a clinical eating disorder anymore, but the after effects will be long lasting because you can do permanent damage to your body, and if the athlete doesn't know they've done that, if they return to sport, they can just damage themselves even more. And I think with me, the increased fatigue is the biggest one, because at the time when I returned to sport, my expectations were I would return and I'd be exactly the same as I would be when I had to leave because of the illness. But my coach, it took him many years to get that out of me. But I think that's just part of being an athlete. Like you want to do as best you can. You have PBs, even if they were 10 years ago, before you were ill, you still feel like you can beat them. And it's just accepting that this has happened, and just try and think, you've got a second chance here, so just trying to accept that. There are relationship problems as well due to the isolation. So obviously, if you're having to drop out of university, what's that doing to the athlete? Not just an athlete, a person. I think these issues, I don't think coaches or anyone in sport can appreciate enough. So that's one of the key messages, really. So what can coaches do? If you're concerned, say something. I haven't put the link here, but there's research showing that one of the reasons, this was female athletes, that they didn't come forward was because the coach did not ask them about it. So I think that was for me as well. I wouldn't ask for help. I'm not really the type of person that asks for help. Because, I think, I don't know whether you find that in your own athletes. You just want to get on with it and it'll be fine. So a lot of the time, coaches or someone else does have to actually ask the athlete whether they're okay. Maybe pull them aside, do it confidentially. Don't do it in front of a big group. And just say, I've noticed these symptoms. I've observed these symptoms. Just, are you okay? And they may say, I don't have a problem. I'm fine. And that's part of the illness. They're not denying it. Just it's what the illness will tell you, that you are fine. There's nothing wrong with you. Read and learn more about eating disorders. Encourage a referral to a GP. I think getting help as soon as possible is the key thing here. Build a professional support network, and encourage help-seeking behaviour. So that's the coach-athlete relationship, checking in. So it's hard during a session if you've got a group of athletes to maybe stop the session and ask a particular athlete, are you doing all right? What's happening? So checking in either at the beginning or at the end of a session, I find are the best times to actually have a meaningful conversation with the athlete. That can be private if you want it to. Educate athletes, other coaches and parents on the importance of eating enough, especially during periods of intense training. Had a conversation with Darren earlier, actually, which reminded me how I used to view food as an athlete. I would always view food as having to earn the food after the training session. I still sometimes do that now, but it's important to view food as a way to fuel your training session. So it removes that link between earning the calories. So if you eat it before, then it's for a reason. It's for performance and it's for keeping yourself well, rather than at the end, because they can easily forget to do that. After a training session, you're really tired. If athletes are required to lose weight, seek support from a sports nutritionist and monitor, especially in weight-based sports. I didn't really have much information around this when I was trying. What have I done here? When I was trying to lose weight to make the weight category, I think overnight I'd lost about 4 kilos, and then I was crying my eyes out when I didn't get a squat in. So I didn't make the connection there. But I think when you're not eating properly, you can't really think rationally. So yeah, you might know after, but during that time you can't really think rationally. You can't bring yourself around. Try and keep the athlete engaged during recovery. That will help with the social support. Healthy, mastery-oriented environment. So that's something that coaches can do, like I spoke about earlier. Some of the techniques about removing the outcome. I know this is quite hard in athletics because you're sometimes just seen as your PB, where you are on the rankings. So it can be hard to remove the outcome altogether, which we don't want to do that. It's part of sport. But if you can just understand, make them understand that sport isn't all about how far you throw, and it's not linked. Say if you don't do well in a competition, it doesn't mean that you're not a good person. I think because athletes can relate their performance to their own self-worth. I've seen at competitions where I don't know whether guys just hide it more, but a lot of girls do end up crying, even if they come 3rd or 4th. And they just say, I'm rubbish, but it's not that, it's nothing wrong with them. It was just a bad day. So maybe separating the sport from themselves, that would be ideal in the long term. Be careful with language, address the individual as opposed to the illness. I think that's one for me as well, actually. So when you, I think it's called emotional decomposition or something like that. I should have really looked that up. It's where if you are diagnosed with something, you're more likely to rapidly deteriorate. So I think because you'll come to terms with. So when I was diagnosed with anorexia, I thought as an athlete, okay, I've been given this label now. I have to be the best anorexic I can be. So maybe refrain from using those terms and just see them as a person rather than as an illness. It would just make them less likely to use that as their own identity. So encourage athletes to widen their sense of identity. The more sources of self-esteem, the better. So how much of the pie does the sport occupy? Promote self-awareness. So for this, athletes can keep diaries for identifying any triggers. So for me, one of mine for my, if I was very fatigued, that would make me want to engage in the disordered eating behaviours more. So, and also in the evenings. So it will be different for every athlete, every individual. So if they can just keep a diary of maybe their behaviours, if they know any triggers, if they're stressed, if they've had a bad competition, if they've had an argument with their family, anything like that, that triggers emotions that make them want to, run 20 laps of the track or something. I don't know. That'll be over-exercising for me, by the way. So if there's any patterns, then that's something you can start to look at. Suggest mindfulness. So Headspace is a great app. I use that just to learn to be, just be without experiencing any emotions or thoughts. I think building the awareness will be great, not just for athletes with eating disorders, athletes in general, because they can become more coachable in the long run, I think, if they're able to understand their body, know where their body is, where all the different limbs are, then that can only benefit their performance as well. So limit comparisons, like I said earlier, be a role model. So limit the talk around, negative talk around your own body. I'm always, if I'm having a bad day, I always try and make sure I don't express that to the athletes that I'm around. I don't want to give them that idea that, there's good and bad. There's no good or bad, it's just what it is. Any long-term complications as well, be aware of them. So I've put a slide in for parents, because I know there's a few here today. Eating disorders do not just affect the individual involved, but their family and friends too. So here are ways that you can hopefully help. So talk to them. So this would have really helped me. So my parents still haven't said the word anorexia ever. They just didn't know what to do. So just it was mainly my coach that stepped up here, Gary Power. He really helped me. I know that if you have a good coach-athlete relationship, then you kind of see them as a father figure or a mother figure anyway. So that was incredibly important. Learn more about eating disorders. Encourage referral to a general practitioner. Prevent negative body talk, same for the coach. Make sure they know you're always there to listen and support them, and be patient and flexible, because you will have many arguments with the athlete if they have disordered eating, because it is very stressful. My brother also helped a little bit, and he had to take time off work because I wasn't allowed to be on my own. So he had to give me 24/7 just to look after me. So he was really a good help as well. Yeah, so what helped me? There's my coach, Alfred Maudsley in the middle. Sadly gone to Wasps rugby, so I don't think he'll be throwing anymore. Encouraged me to come along. In the end, I paid for weekly private therapy. So that was when I went to university. I would drive down an hour and a half every Tuesday, see a doctor, and then go back up. But that really helped me get to the core issue, because the NHS, they'd give you 16 sessions, and then that's it. And I don't think, realistically, that's enough to get to the core issue, really. So if you can afford it, that'd be great. Broaden the sense of identity and coping resources. So I still do a lot in sport, but there's lots of different things I do in sport. I'm not just an athlete anymore. I coach, do sports psychology, do photography at some events as well. Not very good, but I still do it. Redefined what success and achievement meant to me. So this was a massive one, because it also linked to just the messages that my parents and my coach gave me. Well, more my parents really, the negative ones. Growing up, I would get rewarded if I achieved well. If I came second, they'll be like, "Oh, you're not very good anymore." So it's just the messages, and we use this thing in sports psychology, the car journey home. So when you say, when is it the time really to bring it up about their performance? Because if they've performed badly, and within the first maybe few hours, they'll be very emotional, and that's probably not the right time to talk about their performance. So maybe just being aware of how the athlete reacts after a bad performance, how they react after a good performance. For me, success doesn't mean winning anymore. It used to, but now it just means being healthy and just enjoying what you do. So that's the message that I try and get out to athletes now when I'm coaching. Takeaway messages. Eating disorders are very complex. However, you do not have to be an expert, a clinical psychologist, or have personal experience of an eating disorder to provide support to an athlete. They are treatable mental illnesses. Coaches and support staff have important roles to play. Identifying early symptoms are important, making referrals to the right people. So the GP, a clinical psychologist, people in the multidisciplinary team, so physiologist, S&C coach, sports psychologist, just as long as there's good communication between them. I think the more input, the better. Providing valuable ongoing support, reducing unhealthy sport-specific pressures, so some of those techniques that I've gone through, and supporting a return to sport, so remember the long-term implications. So these are just some useful resources. So the Beat Eating Disorder charity stuff that's in your pack, that's available from that website if you wanted to print more copies of it. The UK Sport booklet, that's actually, I think it's 65 pages long, but I think you've got 23 pages. And I think in there there's a SCOF questionnaire, which is a weird name for it, but it's a good tool. It's a good tool to use maybe when you get new athletes to come in, or you can give the questionnaire to athletes once a month, once every 3 months, just so you can monitor their eating attitudes, really, and the behaviours, I think, as well, it measures. So that's a simple, I know I don't really like psychometric measures, but if it's a good talking point, then that's exactly what we need. The NCAA Eating Disorders info, there's a good booklet there, but I think that's quite a few pages long as well, so that's why I didn't get that to be printed. But that's a good one. Yeah, and thank you. Yeah.